This is your first set of notes for this unit on energy and ecosystems. So what I want you to do is to get out your gold packet, turn to page 5, and get ready to take some notes. This first topic that we're going to talk about today is going to be on energy flow through an ecosystem, and we're going to talk about food webs and biodiversity. Let's get started. When we look at a food web, what you're going to see about energy flow is that a general rule is going to show us that arrows on a food web or on a food chain point in the direction of energy flow. Let's look at an example right away. So here we see an example of a food chain. That's organisms that are related because they eat each other. And you can see a bunch of arrows on here. And this is showing the flow of energy. So in this example of a food chain, you have some grasses that are eaten by a grasshopper. The grasshoppers are eaten by a shrew, and the shrew is eaten by a predatory bird. Now there's some terminology that we need to make sure that we get straightened out. And this is going to be on page 5 of your packet. The first thing that we need to get straight is the bottom level of the food chain. Those are called the producers or the autotrophs. Autotroph, if you translate it into what its roots mean, it means self-feeder. And usually, the producers are going to be plants or some organism that can do photosynthesis. And what that means is that they can use energy from the sun to do photosynthesis and make carbohydrates, make energy that can be passed up the food chain. So at the bottom of the food chain, we have our producers. They're producing energy to pass up the food chain, and they're using the energy from the sun to do that. So the autotrophs are at the bottom of the food chain, and then every other level is called a heterotroph, and that means other feeder. And so what that means is that that organism has to eat other organisms in order to get its energy. Besides the producers, everything else is going to be called a heterotroph, but also a consumer, but at different levels. We have primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In this food chain, the grasshopper is called the primary consumers. And the primary consumers eat the producers to get their energy. Energy is flowing in the direction of this arrow. Since the producers are going to be plants, you could also say that usually the primary consumers are going to be herbivores or plant eaters. So write that next to number 1 in your notes on page 5. That there are primary consumers that are also heterotrophs, meaning they eat other organisms, and herbivores, meaning that they eat plants. Moving up the food chain, we next have secondary consumers. And secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. Since primary consumers are other animals, what's going to happen is that the secondary consumers and every consumer above that is going to be a carnivore or meat eater. So, the type of consumers that we have are the primary consumer herbivores, the secondary consumer carnivores, the tertiary consumer carnivores, and so on and so on. So, all of the consumer levels are primary, secondary, tertiary, and in some, there may even be a quaternary consumer. And I think I just spelled that wrong, but we'll go with it. You may have noticed at the bottom of this, there's something called a detritivore or a decomposer. So those are going to be fungi and bacteria. And what the decomposers do is they'll feed on waste and the dead bodies of all of these organisms to recycle their nutrients back into the ecosystem. From their biotic form of the nutrients, how they were fixed in living things, to their abiotic form, where they might go into the soil or into the atmosphere. Now this is a food chain, and the next thing that we want to look at is a food web. But for a quick definition of what a food chain is, it's just one possible pathway of energy and materials, things like carbon or nitrogen, through species in an ecosystem. Now, how a food chain is different than a food web is a food web is just a bunch of interconnected food chains. Here's another example of a food chain. In this case, you see algae, which is the producer. It's going to be doing photosynthesis. Krill is the primary consumer. The herbivore that's going to be eating the algae. Cod are the secondary consumer. Or the carnivore that's going to eat the krill. Leopard seals are the tertiary consumer. The carnivore that's going to eat the cod, and then finally we have a quaternary consumer, the killer whale, that's going to eat the seal. This is one possible pathway for energy, but usually things are more complicated than that. And instead of just one food chain, usually you have a food web. So here's a good definition to write in your notes. So, food webs are just food chains that are interdependent, they depend on one another, and interconnecting. And the best thing to do is look at an example. So here's one of a marine ecosystem, an ecosystem in the water. Can you find that original food chain that we talked about on the last slide? Remember, we had algae going to krill, krill going to cod, cod going to the seals, and the seals going to the killer whale. But you can make a whole bunch of other pathways too. Now when you look at a food web, what you should be able to do is to be able to identify producers, primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary consumers. Now how are you going to know if something's a producer? Well, that's probably the easiest thing to find. Remember that algae was a producer? What you'll see at the level of the producers is that all of the arrows point away from the producers. If there's an arrow pointing to something, then it can't be a producer, it has to be a consumer. So in this example, the only producer that we have is algae. Everything else is a consumer. When you look at this just at a glance, it might kind of look like these small animals and protists are producers, but they're eating the algae right here. Hopefully you could look at this and identify some primary consumers, that's anything that's eating algae, secondary consumers, which is anything that's eating the primary consumers, and so on, up the trophic levels. Now something can exist on a food web in multiple levels. For example, krill are primary consumers because they eat the algae. But also they exist as secondary consumers because they eat these small animals and protists that are primary consumers from eating the algae. So it's okay if things exist at more than one level. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about biodiversity. To complete this page of notes, let's get a definition for biodiversity. So biodiversity is kind of a measurement of all of the different organisms that are there in a food web at each trophic level. So you would just kind of count the organisms up. The thing that's important about biodiversity is that it provides stability. If there was only one organism at each trophic level, what would happen if something catastrophic happened to that organism? Then the whole food web would collapse. But if there are a lot of different organisms at each level, then that's going to provide some stability. And it's all about food sources. So when you look at varieties of organisms at each trophic level, it's all about organisms having more than one food source. So if something happens to one food source, that they're able to have a backup and that they don't become extinct or have to move out of that ecosystem. Let's look at a really good example of biodiversity. Here's another food web, and it's the food web for cod. So you can see that this isn't even readable. Can you find cod in here? It might take you a minute, but hopefully you're able to find cod right in the center of it all. So cod is a common fish that we eat. And the reason that we're able to eat so much of it is because it's in a big biodiverse ecosystem. So there are a lot of food sources for everything in here. So it would be very difficult to overfish cod. You could probably make thousands of individual food chains from this food web. Let's look at another example, but a more simple one of a food web. So to put all this together, I want to review using this food web. Take a minute to look at it, and then let's answer these questions. What are the producers? What are the carnivores? What is the top consumer? And what are the primary consumers? So let's take the first one. What are the producers? Remember, the producers are the autotrophs that turn the energy of the sun into carbohydrates. And here's the sun. What's using the sun energy? Butterfly orchids. So I'm going to put a 1 next to them, saying that we're answering question 1. And bladderworts. They're doing photosynthesis. They're plants. What are the carnivores? Well, remember, if you eat plants, you're called an herbivore. And if you eat other animals, you're called a carnivore. So, grass carp, even though they eat bladderwort, they also eat mosquitoes. So we would call them a carnivore. Blue herons eat the carp. Eastern mud turtles, they are not carnivores because they only eat bladderworts. Alligators eat a whole bunch of different stuff. Raccoons eat the frogs, and the frogs eat mosquitoes. So they're all carnivores. What's the top consumer? Well, in this case, the king of the food web is going to be the alligator. It eats the other carnivores in the food web. If you look at it, you can make various different pathways to the alligator, and it could be a secondary consumer if you go through the way of the turtle, where the turtle would be the primary consumer and the alligator would be the secondary consumer. Or you could have it be a tertiary consumer or even a quaternary consumer. So alligators exist at different levels in this food web. And then what are the primary consumers? Remember, primary consumers are going to be the ones that eat plants, or they're herbivores. So what we're looking at for that, for question 4, are the mosquitoes, since they eat the butterfly orchids, the grass carp, since they eat the bladderwort, and the mud turtle, since they eat the bladderwort as well. Now if you look at this, we could see that the grass carp is not only a primary consumer, but it's a carnivore too. So remember that different organisms can exist at different levels in the food chain. Now we're done with the notes for today, but I want to tell you about a group project where we're going to do presentations next week. This group project is outlined in your packet on page 8. And we're framing it kind of like this. So we're saying that the World Wildlife Fund, the WWF, has some education grants that it needs to hand out, and that we're competing for those as a class. So somebody in the class is going to be awarded the education grant, and your group is going to do a presentation to present a specific ecological issue. Let's look at what the issues are and how you're going to do this presentation. So here are a list of all of the issues on page 9 of your packet. They're all right here. And your group is going to have to pick one of these issues together. So in just a second, you're going to be put into your groups. Then what you're going to do for your first task is to pick one of the issues that is of interest to you guys. And then what you're going to do is you're going to have to split up the research work after I talk about the rubric with you. The idea is that you're going to build a case for your problem to be the one that's kind of the best, the one that's funded and most interesting. And we're going to have a vote at the end. So here are your groups. The sub also has a list of these groups. Take a minute to find yourself, and I drew a box around each group. Each group is going to consist of you and 2 or 3 people that sit around you. And this is based on the seating chart that we've been using for the last couple weeks. So in just a minute, after I present the rubric, you're going to split into your groups at a different table, or just pull your desks together, and you're going to decide on the topic that you're going to present, and you're going to decide how you're going to split up the work. The teacher is going to have a sign-up sheet so that multiple groups won't sign up for the same thing. So, if there's something that you really like, be sure that you sign up for it right away. Now, let's take a look at the rubric. You're going to have about 45 minutes, or one period of each class, to do research in class, and then you're probably going to have to work outside of the class as well. If you're in a group of 3 people, this is how I want you to break it down. One person is going to explain the problem. Another person is going to talk about the food web that's impacted by the problem. And a third person is going to do a profile of an endangered species in that food web. If you have a fourth person in your group, the fourth person is going to profile another endangered species. So you're going to have to break this up. Now, you can see that each of these is split equally with 15 points, and you're going to earn points based on what you do for your part of the project. So you're going to tell me which section you're in charge of. Then, next week what's going to happen, you'll do your research, and then you'll put together a group presentation. And the rubric for the presentation part is on page 11, so you'll want to take a look at that. You'll get an individual score based on your presentation, and then an overall score as well. Your presentation has to be 5 to 7 minutes in length, or else you lose all of these points. So you're going to have to be sure to rehearse it once things start coming together next week. Finally, after we hear all of the presentations, you're going to have to pick which one is best and cast your vote by writing an individual Melcon. So what I want you to do right now is for you to organize into your group. I want you to pick which of those bulleted point topics your group wants to do as a project, and then divide up who's going to explain the problem, who's going to present the impacted food web, and who's going to talk about endangered species in that food web.